In this lesson, I'm going to show you how to set up your project to do preview and full res renders using Octane. So before I talk you through some of the settings we're going to be using to render, I'm going to add some depth of field and motion blur to the scene. So if I head over to my first camera and go to frame 0, we can see we've got our depth of field target here, which is going to allow us to have control about where we want to position our focus. And that is inside our camera object, inside the focus object section. Now if we head over to our Octane camera tag and go to thin lens, we can go to depth of field, and I'm going to turn autofocus off, and that's going to give our depth of field target the control of the depth of field. So now if I add, say, 50 centimeters to the aperture, you can see that that's going to really push the depth of field, and you can see what area is actually in focus at the moment. So now if we adjust our target, you can actually see we're controlling whereabouts we are actually focusing on. We can pick our spot. There's pretty good. I'm going to reduce my aperture down to something that's not as extreme. So now we're still getting depth of field here in the background and like on the lower levels, and these sort of planes up here, which are a little bit higher, are getting a bit more focused. I'm going to scrub through to, say, frame 48 and just make sure that majority of the image is actually still in focus, because we don't want everything to be blurry. I think that's pretty good. And you can actually animate your depth of field target if you want as well, in order to change where you want the focus to be. Let's do our next camera. I need to refresh the fracture because Octane's having a moment. Same again, head to my camera 2 tag, turn autofocus off. I'm going to zoom in and take the aperture up to 50. Maybe it's even 100, just so we can really see what's going on. We are still kind of focused on this. I can adjust my target a bit more. I can actually just select this render region here, so we're just focusing on this. I might go around about there and see how we're looking for the rest of the image. So again, going to take this down to, say, 10, just so we get a sense of depth of field, but it doesn't overpower the image. And for the final shot, we're not actually going to add any depth of field. I want to keep everything fairly clean, and I think from a top-down view, I don't think I actually want to have any depth of field. It's not processor friendly. Use depth of field where you need it. Let's add some motion blur to the scene. So if I head to my camera tags, I'm just going to select all 3. I'm going to go to motion blur, and I'm going to select enable. I'm going to make the shutter 0.02, and I'm going to disable camera motion blur. So that's going to tell Octane I don't want motion blur on the camera movement. If you go to your help here, you can also see in the camera tag options, there's a section on motion blur, so you can go through and read through about what your motion blur should be set to depending on the effect that you want and also frame rate that you're using. The final thing we need to do is add a Octane object tag. Just press Shift-C and I'm selecting Octane object tag, and I'm just dropping that on with the object motion blur set to transform. So now we should have some motion blur. It won't be obvious until you do a preview render. And finally, before we set things up to render, I'm going to change a few attributes in the animation. because I've done a couple of quick test hardware renders and I felt that the speed was a bit too fast and that the seed of some of the noise could be changed. So I'm just going to quickly do that. So I'm just going to head over to my effectors and go to my shader effector. I'm going to come down to my noise and I'm changing the seed. I found a seed that I felt worked, and that was 690. I also changed the speed of my animation to 0.75, and the random seed I also changed. I have found that on frame 49 I wanted it to be 67, and then I'm going to keyframe that, and on frame 50, because we change cameras, I can actually change the seed, and I'm going to make that 61. And all that is doing now, it's just given me a little bit more variation in my design, for that shot there, and then I changed it for these two shots. This object here was actually just a little bit more interesting because I think the blue piece was up for a majority of the time in the last version of that animation. It's just a couple of quick changes before set things up to render. So the first thing I'm going to do is play with my Octane settings. The settings I've been using for previewing. We can probably reduce these a bit more, some of the settings anyway. So I'm going to pull my diffuse depth down to 8, and we can just see the effect that's having, making sure that the scene doesn't become too dark. And this is the specular depth, so this is how many times I believe the light bounces on the specular. Again, you can check out the different settings in the Octane help section. I've reduced those two, and I can pull the GI clamp down to see, have a look in here and see if it gets too dark. So you can see if we pull that really far down, the scene gets really dark because the light isn't bouncing around. So I'm just going to pull that up, and I'm going to leave that at, say, 20. And by reducing these settings, it's going to actually speed up the render. What we do need to add, though, is a bit more samples, because otherwise the image will be noisy. We could keep this at 1024, but if you want the image to be a bit cleaner, we can add some more samples to it. For a high-res render, I generally run with 2048 for something like this, that's 1920 by 1080. Depending on your computer, how many graphics cards you have, and you might have to adjust this number to work for you. Maybe you need to keep it on 1024 to actually get through the render, and then you can use a denoiser or something like that. But for a high-res render, anywhere between 2000 and 3000 for something like this, I think would be fine for noise, because there's not a lot of glass or anything like that as well. These settings would be okay. Now if we head up to our render settings, I'm going to save this current setup, so the hardware render, and just call that animatic. And I'm going to create a new render setting by selecting on the render setting here and selecting new. And I'm going to call this style frames. So we're going to create a couple of stills. In my renderer, I'm going to change this to Octane and make sure the settings are set to 1920 by 1080. Frame rate doesn't really matter, but I'll change it to 25 because we're going to be creating stills. We can change this to manual because we're going to be selecting specific frames that we're going to be rendering for stills. In save, I'm going to select TIFF and 16-bit, just so we have a bit more color information to play with. In the file directory, if we come here, C4D project, we can see we've got a render file here, and I've just set up a stills folder. So I might actually set up a animation preview folder. I can set up an animation master folder. We can even create an animatic folder. I can see that I've got my project files here, and I've got this render folder here, and individual folders for the different renders that we're about to output. So what I can actually do to keep things simple and organized is I can press a full stop, / render. What we're saying is let's go into this folder, which is the render folder. And then we're going to go into the stills and then / $PRJ. So that's saying, let's go into the stills folder and then save with the same project name as our project. That's a really useful way. So if you save an iteration of this project file, it'll actually save it as rendering 02 or rendering 03. So that way you don't have to keep coming in here to change the render settings where the files are going to be saved. So that's a useful way of working. So the next thing we're going to do is head down to Octane Renderer. We don't need to change anything here. Maybe you could select to use all GPUs, depending on how many GPUs you have. And if you're using a render farm, always good to use all GPUs. Don't need to change the overwrite kernel settings because we're going to be using the settings that I've set up here. But we do need to change the render passes because we want to have the option to adjust some of the settings in post in After Effects. So I want to have control of pink material and the blue material, like basically being able to change maybe the exposures individually of these different colors. I'm going to enable this render pass. In format, I'm going to go to TIFF and keep this at 16-bit. Turn multi-file off. Tone map type, I'm going to change the tone map. And the only other thing I need to do is select material ID. So what that's actually going to do, if I head over to my live viewer, I can actually select the info pass that I've ticked. So if I select this, you can see what that pass is going to give us. So in After Effects, we're going to be able to key out individual colors in order to apply adjustment layers to them. If we want to bring the exposure down on this, I'll be able to just select the green and say, let's bring the exposure down on these sections here. So that's going to be really useful to have that render pass. The only other thing we need to do is, again, if we just copy and paste from the save file, we can copy and paste where that material ID is going to be. I can turn that off. We need to be specific about which frames we want rendered. So I'm actually going to duplicate this. Call this camera 1. We can basically just pick a frame. So say frame 3. Keeping the frame range on manual, I'm going to select from 3 to 3. And then I'm going to duplicate. So camera 2, I'm going to pick a frame here. Just something that's got a little bit of variation and detail in it. Let's pick that frame, what's that, 79. Do the same, just from and to with this camera selected. And then I'm going to copy that again. I'm just pressing Control and Command and dragging. So camera 3, I'm going to go right to the end of camera 3. Render frame 175, just so we can see the final frame of the animation. That's our style frame setup. What we can do here is we can render this first and see what the quality is like and also see how long the render actually takes. We might need to adjust the settings because we need the render to be quicker. What I'm going to do is I'm going to set up some takes. So this take system, I'll leave a link in the additional notes about the take system you can read up on. This is going to allow us to create some setups so we can just press on different takes in order to select different setups that we want. Then I'm going to press Control and duplicate that and call this camera 1. Camera 2 and 3. So for camera 1, I want to select camera 1. So this is the render settings which are here. So I'm going to select camera 1 for that. Camera 2, That's camera 2, and the camera 2 render settings. And again, so now if I select these 3 buttons here, I can actually press render marked takes to picture viewer, and that's going to render these 3 takes. Just quickly press render and we can have a look at what that does. I can see we've got our depth of field working. It's calculating exactly how long it thinks it might take, so it looks like it's around about a minute at the moment. You can see here we've got what our samples are set at, so 2048. We're slowly making our way towards that number. Got our amount of graphics cards we're using and the temperature of the cards.